Well, who even ever heard of the phrase social distancing a year ago? I mean, it would have sounded like a very bad thing, socially distancing. And yet now it's part of our lingo, part of our verbiage. This year, on my birthday, which was in January, I received a birthday card from my good friend Kelly. And I just thought it was so telling of our times. I don't know if you can see that. Here we have two little stick figures 6 feet apart. And it says, I miss you. I miss you. Social distancing. We're going to look at that verbiage, distance. Distance. And what does that mean? Welcome to pandemic 2020/2021. We've come to know exactly, unfortunately, we know only too well what it means to socially distance, to stand at a distance, to stand at a distance. And because of that, I was somewhat taken aback when I was doing my read through on the daily Bible reading plan, and I happened to be in Exodus, and I came across the verbiage stand at a distance. And I was like, stand at a distance in Exodus? That seems so contemporary to our world today. So that really caught my eye. Anyway, it's in Exodus 2, verse 4. But let me unfold the story a little bit and give you some background on who it is that is standing at a distance and why. The story begins in Exodus chapter 1 with the nation of Israel still in Egypt. Remember, they had gone there a mere 400 years earlier, i.e., the story of Joseph. So here's just Cliff Notes version of that background. Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers. While in Egypt, Joseph rises up in power because he is able to interpret the Pharaoh's dream. Long story short, there's going to be 7 years of plenty, agriculturally speaking, and 7 years of famine. And Joseph, because he can interpret this dream, he becomes the overseer of the grain, and he rises up in power. The brothers come to Egypt to buy grain because there is also famine in Canaan where they live. Joseph, shocker, here's his brothers. He winds up, as the story unfolds in Genesis, Joseph reveals himself eventually. The family is reunited. Father Jacob travels to Egypt. All the family is reunited. Meanwhile, that Pharaoh dies. At some point, that Pharaoh dies. And the nation of Israel has stayed there. I don't know why they stayed there. I've often wondered, at the end of the 7 years of famine, as the economy is coming back, why did they not say, okay, guys, let's go back home? I don't know. We're not told in Scripture, but they didn't. And so 400 years forward, they are still there. And if you will recall the promise made to Abraham that his descendants would be numberless, you couldn't count them. The stars in the sky, the sands on the shore, they cannot be counted. And this is going on. This blessing is being fulfilled even there in Egypt. It's counting. And we pick up in Exodus 1, verse 8. Let me read it to you because now there's a new Pharaoh in town. Pharaoh is a generic for the leader. It's a Egyptian verbiage for their leader. And so he's called Pharaoh, but he's not the same Pharaoh of Joseph's days, obviously, 400 years. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He doesn't know Joseph. He doesn't know the history or what has gone on in the past. I won't read all of Exodus 1, but this new king, this new Pharaoh, gets concerned about these prolific Israelites, plethora of them. They just keep coming. Matter of fact, in verse 9 through 10, he says to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." So that's Pharaoh's concern with all this large number of people. What if they escaped from the land? There would go their free labor. You see, because this new king had turned the Israelites into slaves, he's thinking, if they band together and they're out of here, we've lost our free labor. We're building our cities. So he's fearful of them banding together against him, but he doesn't want to lose them because they are underwriting the economy, so to speak, because of the slave labor as they build. The king of Egypt is now looking for a way to protect his interest, if you will. He's trying to contain the situation. So what he does is set taskmasters over them. Then he comes up with the idea to get the Hebrew midwives to kill, destroy any boy baby that is born to a Hebrew woman. Well, these midwives, they feared God, and so they let the male children live. They did not comply with what Pharaoh had asked. And what they told the king was, I think it's kind of funny the way they put it, these Hebrew women aren't like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous, and they give birth before the midwife even gets there. Well, God blessed them in their desire to protect life. The king comes up with another plan. He says, verse 22, let's read it. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." Let me pause here just a minute. We are on the cusp of God delivering the nation of Israel out of Egypt, taking them back to Canaan. The land had been promised to Abraham, and God is going to get them back there. If you were in charge of this, if I was in charge of this, how would we raise up a deliverer for this plethora of Israelites? Actually, commentators say in the neighborhood of 2 million people, men, women, and children. So who would you pick? How would you pick someone to be the deliverer, to bring them out of bondage? Under what circumstances would you raise up this deliverer? I was thinking about this and I thought, well, it would need to be someone strong and powerful. It would need to be someone with a great deal of confidence. It needs to be someone that Pharaoh will listen to. We think logically of it, but do you know that God chose an infant Hebrew boy baby to be the deliverer? The most vulnerable, at-risk people group of the day, Jewish boy babies. It's a marvel that Moses even survived infancy in order to grow up and be the deliverer. Because remember, verse 22, the Pharaoh commanded every son born to the Hebrews cast into the Nile. Let every daughter live. When you read the Old Testament history and you come across stories like this, narratives like this, it just further substantiates a truth that we already know, that being that our God is sovereign. And it gives substance, if you will, to other verses throughout Scripture that we're familiar with. It just substantiates them. Verses like, and I'm going to give you 3, and these are great verses to make a note of, to speak back to ourselves when we need to be reminded of who our God is. Jeremiah 32:27. Behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is anything too hard for me? Isaiah 59:1. Behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened, that it cannot save, or his ear dull, that it cannot hear. Numbers 11:23. And the Lord said to Moses, this is at the point of reference actually when Moses has grown up and he's actually traveling on the journey with these 2 million plus people. And they grumbled along the way. An interesting read. The Lord said to Moses, Is the Lord's hand shortened? Now you shall see whether my word will come true for you or not. Nothing, point being, nothing is too hard for the Lord. And I think about that, and I come back into 21st century thinking, our day today. Is God scared or unnerved because of COVID? No. Has the realm of the United States current political climate and structure got him nervous? No. He puts leaders in place. He raises up and brings the demise up in accordance with his will. Is the economy a problem for him? Is your health a problem for him? What about your relationships? Are they a problem for God? What about your children's lives? The things we worry about, how's God perceiving it? What's his take on it? No. His hand, he is all power, and his hand is not shortened, that he cannot work in accordance with his plans and with his will in the lives of all of us. He can raise up a Moses from out of the bulrushes, placed there by a grieving mother, just trying to buy her infant son a little time, maybe hoping for a miracle. And that's exactly what she got. I mean, exactly what she got. Who could have imagined that a mighty God would reach down into the climate of that environment and say, I have chosen a deliverer from the riskiest, most unlikely, most vulnerable people group there is, a Jewish boy baby, and that's who I choose. But how better to give God all credit and all glory than to work within the realm of the unlikely and or impossible. And here's where we pick up with our socially distancing that I first read in chapter 2 in Exodus. Let me read the scripture. Exodus 2, 3-4. When she could hide him no longer, you see, Moses' mother did attempt to hide her baby. When she could hide him no longer, she's hidden him at this point for 3 months. She took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. What are the chances? What are the chances? Well, with God, the chances are 100%. When It is his ordained choice. It's going to happen just like he wants it to happen. Albeit Miriam doesn't know this. Moses' sister doesn't know this yet, nor does Moses' mother. And that brings me to think, are there times when God calls us to stand at a distance? We've certainly seen it over the last 11 plus months. Do you feel like the plan that you had for yourself or for your family or for your children has been taken from you? Maybe you feel like it's been manipulated in one manner or another. It's not, you're being forced to make choices that you would not make, but the powers that be have said no school or the virtual school or hybrid school. Words we didn't even know existed, and we use them commonplace now. Maybe you feel like your life's being manipulated beyond what you desire. And you hate it? You despise it? I don't know. Maybe you feel like your children are going to suffer irreparably because of it all. These are sentiments that I have heard people verbalize. You've probably heard it too. Maybe we've said it ourselves during this pandemic. And I wonder, as I consider that, what was going on in Moses's mother's mind and heart as she built a boat, a floating basket? Did she think, what are my son's chances? How is he going to suffer? Will he make it? What was going through her head? Which brings us to our main point. Our main point of this lesson is actually the main point of doing life. It's not just the main point of this lesson. It is the main point of doing life, of surviving life, perhaps better put. Be it a pandemic, be it illness, be it relationship issues, be it living in a society where pharaohs make ungodly decisions. Whatever the circumstance, the main point is trust God. That sounds simple. That sounds easy to say. When the fire heats up, when push comes to shove, it can be a challenge within our flesh to do this. But just trust God. He is always doing exceedingly abundantly more than we even know to think, ask, or imagine. We have got to trust God's more, his more. Of course, I'm referencing Ephesians 3:20 through 21. What a beautiful, beautiful, comforting verse those are. Well, for Moses' mother, who couldn't even watch, she steps away. And for Miriam, the sister, who stood at a distance, God's more involved Pharaoh's daughter, who, according to Exodus 2:5-6, came down, saw, sent for, took, opened, and took pity. Let me kind of recap it for you. She came down, coincidentally, to bathe. She saw the basket. She sent her servant to get the basket. She took it, she opened it, she took pity on this Hebrew child. This is God at work. God's more. Miriam, we see Miriam in God's more. She moves from her distance, verse 7, over towards Pharaoh's daughter, asking, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter says, "Why, yes, what a great idea, and I will pay her wages." God at work. God at work. And so, through the exceedingly abundant more of God, Moses' mother gets to keep her baby and nurse him. I was looking up, trying to see if I could get a rough idea of how long a baby would nurse in that day and within that culture. And according to Jewish rabbinical traditions, weaning could take place anywhere between 18 months and 5 years of age. Weaning was a big deal. It was an occasion that was celebrated when they came to the place of being weaned because of the fragility of life, the expectancy of life for infants in that day and time. The fact you made it to the point of weaning was celebrated. So it basically is recognizing that the child had survived infancy. Therefore, weaning isn't necessarily rushed, if you can catch my drift. We aren't sure how long Moses was with his mother, but it was long enough that he considered the Hebrews his people. In Exodus 2, verse 11, it says, "One day when Moses had grown up," and we know, you see the connection of all of Scripture. If you reference from there to Acts 7, in that chapter where Stephen is giving a speech, he recounts the history of Israel. And he references this occasion, and he says that he was 40. So, one day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. Well, we don't have time to unfold the entirety of this story, but again, Cliff Notes version, Moses, age 40, has risen up and is a defender and protector of his people, the Hebrews. But then Pharaoh hears about it and he sought to kill Moses. We see that in verse 15. Moses, fearing for his life, flees Egypt. Where does he go? He goes to the wilderness of Midian, where he winds up meeting Jethro, who becomes his father-in-law and whose sheep he tends. And according to Stephen's speech in Acts 7, he spent 40 years in that wilderness. I thought that was very interesting. Let me read that verse, Acts 7, verse 30. Now when 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai in a flame of fire in a bush. You know, I think about the more of God and what he was doing in Moses' life. We come back to that word distanced. We had Miriam who stood at a distance originally, but God was working. We have Moses who was distanced from his Hebrew family, from his mother and father and his sister, but God was working. We have Moses who was further distanced into the wilderness for 40 years, but God was working. We know on this side of the story that same Moses is going to be herding people for 40 years in the wilderness through the desert. Is he being groomed for the job? It's such an interesting ponderment as you look and watch a person's life just be played out in Scripture. I think about the past 11 months for us, and we may have felt distanced from fill in the blank. Maybe we have felt distanced from our family. Certainly there have been times where we have been either quarantined or for whatever reasons, we could not be around our family, or you had people in your family that were in age categories or health situation categories that made them vulnerable, and we were distanced from family, distanced from friends. We have been distanced from activities, from travel, from vacations. We've been distanced in our work. We can't be around coworkers. People are working at home. We have seen ourselves be distanced from church, from our friends at church, from worshiping together in the way that we were accustomed to. Our ladies' organization has been doing Zoom meetings. Who ever heard of Zoom before the pandemic? We have been distanced, but we need to trust God. We need to trust the more that He's always up to. I don't think Moses and Miriam and Moses' mother, all of these necessarily, they didn't know what God had in store for Moses 80 years down the road. But they just walked it out in faith, day by day by day. Keep walking the thing out, knowing that our situation has not gone unnoticed by God. We need to remain faithful and trust Him. Will there be groaning? Perhaps, perhaps, perhaps. But let's take that groaning to God. Let's cry out to Him. And I say that because in Exodus 2:23 through 25, we learned that when the people were groaning because of their slavery, Moses is still in Midian, they're groaning because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered His covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. God knew. The Hebrews had no idea what God's plan was. How could they have known? But God did have a plan. He had a plan when He rescued a little Hebrew baby boy named Moses. And now, 80 years later, it's time. It's time. Do you think the Hebrews thought it should have been time when their babies were being put in the river? Do you think that they thought it should have been time when they were slaves making bricks? Do you think it should have been time way before God determined it was time? Do we? Do we think it should be time now? You know, we've been going on 11 months within the pandemic. But again, it comes back to trusting God. He is the keeper of the clock. We trust Him. We wake up in the morning and we trust Him. We trust His timing with this day. We've been given this day. And we walk it out knowing He is always doing exceedingly abundantly more than we even know to ask, think, or imagine. Trust God. He has a plan. You know, when we read stories like the one of, I don't even want to call it a story, truths, like this narrative of Moses and his family and his sister, these difficult times that people go through, it helps us. It helps us. It helps to put our lives in perspective and helps us to know we can do this. We can do this. Trust God and keep going, knowing He is faithful.